I am writing this account to document the events that occurred during my winter stay at the Hartwell cabin in the Colorado Rockies between January 15th and March 3rd of last year. What I experienced during those 7 weeks has fundamentally altered my understanding of the natural world and the boundaries between rational explanation and something far more ancient and predatory. My name is Jonah West. I am 34 years old, a freelance journalist with 15 years of experience, covering everything from political corruption to environmental disasters. I mention my professional background because I want to establish that I am not given to flights of fancy or supernatural speculation. My career has been built on facts, verification, and rational analysis of complex situations. The circumstances that led me to the Hartwell cabin began with a series of personal and professional setbacks that had left me questioning both my career trajectory and my life choices. An investigative piece I'd spent 8 months developing had fallen apart when my primary source recanted his testimony under pressure from his employer. My relationship with Sarah, my partner of 3 years, had ended badly when she discovered I'd been lying about the financial strain my freelance work was putting on both of us. By December, I was facing eviction from my Denver apartment and had burned through most of my professional contacts through a combination of missed deadlines and increasingly erratic behavior. The cabin rental was advertised as a writer's retreat on a vacation rental website, offering complete isolation and stunning mountain views at a price I could barely afford with my remaining credit. The listing mentioned that the property was accessible only by a winding mountain road that required 4-wheel drive during winter months, and that the nearest neighbor was more than 5 miles away. For someone seeking to escape the complications of modern life and focus on salvaging what remained of his career, it seemed perfect. I drove up to the cabin on a gray January afternoon when the temperature was hovering around 15 degrees Fahrenheit and snow was falling in thick, heavy flakes that reduced visibility to less than 50 yards. The access road was narrow and treacherous, switchbacking up the mountainside through dense stands of pine and aspen that pressed close to the gravel surface like curious observers. My Honda Civic, despite its all-wheel drive system, struggled with the steep grades and loose snow, and more than once I considered turning back. The Hartwell cabin appeared suddenly around a sharp curve, perched on a rocky outcrop that offered commanding views of the valley below. The structure was larger than I'd expected, a 2-story log building with a steep metal roof designed to shed heavy snow loads, and a wraparound porch that looked out over an endless expanse of mountains and forest. Smoke rose from the stone chimney, and warm light glowed from the windows, suggesting someone had prepared for my arrival. I was unloading my supplies from the car when a man emerged from the cabin's front door. He was perhaps 60 years old, with graying hair and the kind of weathered face that spoke of decades spent in harsh mountain conditions. His clothing was practical and well-worn: insulated boots, heavy wool pants, and a thick down jacket that had seen better days. When he introduced himself as Avery Hartwell, the cabin's caretaker, his handshake was firm but brief, and his eyes carried the careful reserve of someone who'd learned to be wary of strangers. "You picked a hell of a week to come up here," he said, gesturing toward the darkening sky. "Weather Service is calling for another 18 inches before morning, and the wind's supposed to get worse after sunset." As Avery helped me carry my belongings inside, he provided a brief overview of the cabin's systems and amenities. The structure was equipped with solar panels supplemented by a diesel generator for power, a propane heating system with multiple zones, and a well that provided fresh water year-round. The kitchen was fully stocked with non-perishable foods, and the living room featured a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall, woods already split and stacked on the back porch. Avery explained as he showed me how to operate the damper system for the fireplace. "Should be enough to last you through the worst of the weather. Just make sure you keep the fire going overnight. The backup heating system can't keep up when it gets really cold." After completing the tour, Avery pulled a folded sheet of paper from his jacket pocket and handed it to me. The paper was yellowed with age and had clearly been photocopied multiple times, with the kind of slightly blurred text that suggested it had been reproduced from an even older original. "House rules," he said simply. "Previous guests have found them helpful." I unfolded the paper and read the contents. The Hartwell cabin rules never. Go outside after sundown for any reason. Do not venture past the tree line during or after a snowstorm. If you hear whistling in the wind, do not respond or investigate. Keep the main fireplace burning at all times between sunset and sunrise. Do not follow voices calling from the woods. Regardless of familiarity, lock all doors and windows before dark. If something knocks after midnight, do not answer. I looked up from the paper to find Avery watching me with an expression of serious concern that seemed disproportionate to what appeared to be a collection of common-sense winter safety guidelines mixed with what I assumed were local superstitions. These are thorough, I said, trying to keep any hint of amusement out of my voice. They exist for good reasons, Avery replied, his tone flat and matter-of-fact. Previous guests who followed them have had pleasant, peaceful stays. Those who haven't, he paused, staring out at the darkening forest beyond the windows. Well, let's just say that some folks have cut their visits short. I folded the paper and tucked it into my shirt pocket, nodding with what I hoped was appropriate gravity. Avery gathered his tools and headed toward the door, pausing on the threshold to deliver a final warning. I'll be back to check on you in a few days, weather permitting. Until then, remember that you're completely isolated up here. Cell phone coverage is spotty at best, and if something goes wrong, help is a long way away. He pulled his knit cap down over his ears and stepped out into the swirling snow. Follow the rules, Mr. West. They've kept people safe for longer than you might think. After Avery's truck disappeared down the mountain road, I stood alone in the cabin's main room, listening to the wind beginning to pick up outside and the comfortable crackling of the fire in the stone hearth. The rules felt heavy in my pocket, but I dismissed them as the kind of colorful local folklore that isolated mountain communities often developed to add mystery to their tourist attractions. I was here to write, to think, and to figure out how to rebuild my career and my life. I had neither the time nor the inclination to worry about superstitious warnings that probably dated back to the cabin's original construction decades earlier. That first night, I unpacked my clothes and computer equipment, organized my research materials on the cabin's rustic dining table, and settled in front of the fireplace with a glass of whiskey and a legal pad to begin outlining the book I hoped would restore my professional reputation. Outside, the wind howled through the pine trees with increasing intensity, and snow continued to fall in thick curtains that reduced the world beyond the windows to a uniform grey-white void. I was confident that a few weeks of isolation and focused work would be exactly what I needed to get my life back on track. I had no way of knowing that the rules in my pocket were the only thing standing between me and forces that had been waiting in the Colorado wilderness far longer than human memory could record. My second night at the Hartwell cabin began with the kind of pristine mountain silence that city dwellers rarely experience. No traffic noise, no mechanical hums, no human voices carrying through thin apartment walls. The only sounds were the gentle crackling of the fireplace and the occasional settling groan of the cabin's timber frame adjusting to the dropping temperature. Outside, I had spent the day making significant progress on my book outline, a non-fiction work exploring the psychological factors that drive individuals to become whistleblowers in corporate and government settings. The isolation was proving beneficial for my concentration, and I felt more mentally focused than I had in months. By evening, I was cautiously optimistic that the mountain retreat might actually help me salvage both my career and my financial situation. The weather had cleared during the afternoon, leaving behind several inches of fresh snow and a sky brilliant with stars that seemed impossibly bright in the thin mountain air. The temperature, according to the cabin's outdoor thermometer, had dropped to 8 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that the windows were covered with intricate frost patterns that sparkled in the firelight. At approximately 9:30 p.m., I was reviewing my notes from the day when I became aware of a change in the wind patterns outside. What had been a steady, low moaning through the pine branches shifted to something more complex, a series of rising and falling tones that almost resembled music. I initially attributed this to the natural acoustic effects created when wind passes through different types of terrain and vegetation, a phenomenon I'd read about but never personally experienced. But as I continued to listen, the sounds became more structured, more purposeful. Within the general whistle of wind through trees, I began to distinguish what sounded remarkably like a human voice, distant and wordless, but unmistakably vocal rather than purely meteorological. Curiosity overcame caution, and I moved to the living room's large picture window to get a better sense of what might be causing such unusual acoustic effects. The view was spectacular, moonlight illuminating the snow-covered landscape in shades of blue and silver, with the dark silhouettes of pine trees creating dramatic shadows across the sloping terrain. But as I watched, the whistling sound grew more distinct, and I could swear I heard my own name being called from somewhere in the forest below the cabin. Jonah. Jonah. The voice was faint but clear, carrying a tone of urgency that immediately triggered my instinct to respond. Someone might be lost in the woods, disoriented by the cold and darkness, calling for help from anyone within hearing range. I grabbed my heavy winter coat and moved toward the front door, already formulating a plan to use the cabin's porch lights and my own voice to guide a stranded traveler to safety. I had my hand on the door handle when I remembered the folded paper in my shirt pocket. Rule number 3. If you hear whistling in the wind, do not respond or investigate. I paused, caught between rational concern for another human being and the explicit warning I'd been given less than 24 hours earlier. The voice continued calling from the woods, and now it sounded not just urgent but desperate, with an edge of panic that suggested someone in genuine distress. Against my better judgment, or what I thought was my better judgment at the time, I opened the door and stepped onto the cabin's front porch. The cold hit me like a physical blow, and my breath immediately formed clouds of vapor in the frigid air. I called out into the darkness, "Hello? Is someone out there? Can you hear me?" The response was immediate and deeply unsettling. The moment my voice carried into the night air, the whistling stopped completely. The sudden silence was so absolute that I could hear my own heartbeat and the soft hiss of my breath in the cold air. Then, with a sound like a rifle shot, the cabin's front door slammed shut behind me. I spun around and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't turn. The door, which had opened smoothly just moments before, was now locked solid, as if the mechanism had frozen or jammed. I pushed against the heavy wooden panel with increasing desperation, but it remained immovable. Through the frosted glass panels beside the door, I could see the warm glow of the fireplace and the comfortable interior I had just abandoned for the freezing mountain night. The temperature on the porch felt even colder than the 8 degrees registered by the thermometer, and I was acutely aware that I was wearing only jeans, a sweater, and a winter coat, adequate for a brief step outside, but woefully insufficient for any extended exposure to sub-zero conditions. Frostbite could begin affecting exposed skin within minutes in such temperatures, and hypothermia would follow soon after. I pounded on the door and shouted, hoping to attract the attention of whom? I was alone on an isolated mountain, miles from the nearest neighbor, with no cell phone coverage and no way to summon help. The absurdity of my situation became clear. I was calling for rescue from a predicament caused by my attempt to rescue someone else who might not even exist. After several minutes of increasingly frantic efforts to force the door, I heard the lock mechanism click. The handle turned smoothly, and I stumbled back into the cabin's blessed warmth, gasping with relief and adrenaline. I immediately checked the door's locking mechanism, but it appeared to be functioning normally. No ice buildup, no obvious mechanical problems, nothing that would explain why it had locked me out. I spent the rest of the night sitting close to the fireplace, replaying the incident in my mind and trying to develop a rational explanation for what had occurred. The most logical theory was that the door had indeed frozen temporarily, possibly due to moisture in the locking mechanism that had crystallized in the extreme cold. The voice in the woods could have been wind creating acoustic illusions, or perhaps a distant radio transmission carrying through the clear mountain air. But these explanations felt inadequate, forced. The voice had been too clear, too human, and too specifically directed at me, and the timing of the door malfunction, occurring at the exact moment I violated rule number 3, seemed too coincidental to dismiss. As dawn broke over the mountains, I found myself holding the folded rule sheet and reading it with new attention. What I had initially dismissed as quaint local folklore now felt like practical guidance based on genuine experience. Someone had taken the time to document specific behaviors that led to specific problems, and they had done so with the kind of precision that suggested hard-won knowledge rather than superstitious speculation. I folded the paper and returned it to my pocket, but this time I did so with the intention of following its guidelines exactly. My brief exposure to the mountain night had taught me that isolation changes the calculus of risk in ways that urban living never prepares you for. Up here, a single mistake could have consequences that no amount of rational thinking or professional experience could overcome. The whistling in the wind had stopped with the sunrise, but I found myself listening for it throughout the day, dreading its return while simultaneously hoping I had imagined the entire incident. I had come to the mountains seeking solitude and clarity. Instead, I was discovering that some forms of isolation come with their own indigenous dangers and their own indigenous wisdom about how to survive them. My third day at the Hartwell cabin brought an unexpected interruption to the solitude I had been seeking. I was working at the dining room table, transcribing handwritten notes into my laptop, when I heard the sound of a vehicle struggling up the access road. The engine noise grew louder as it approached, punctuated by the metallic scraping of snow chains against gravel and the occasional rev of an engine fighting for traction on the steep grades. A red Subaru Outback appeared through the trees, its roof and hood covered with snow, exhaust vapor streaming from its tailpipe in the cold air. The vehicle pulled into the cleared area beside my Honda, and after a moment, the driver's door opened to reveal a woman in her late 20s with shoulder-length brown hair and the kind of confident demeanor that suggested she was accustomed to handling challenging situations. She introduced herself as Claire Morrison, a photographer from Boulder, who had been driving through the area when the weather turned bad. Her original destination had been a ski resort 40 miles further up the mountain highway, but road conditions had deteriorated to the point where continuing was no longer safe. She had seen the cabin from the main road and hoped to find shelter until the weather improved enough to allow her to reach her intended destination. Claire was articulate, charming, and completely unprepared for winter mountain conditions. Her vehicle was loaded with photography equipment and ski gear, but her clothing consisted of designer winterwear that prioritized style over function. Her boots, while expensive, lacked the aggressive tread patterns necessary for secure footing on ice and snow. Most critically, she carried herself with the casual confidence of someone who had never encountered a situation that couldn't be resolved through determination and resourcefulness. I invited her inside, partly out of genuine concern for her safety, and partly because I welcomed the opportunity for human conversation after 3 days of complete isolation. The cabin was certainly large enough to accommodate both of us, and the prospect of having company during the long mountain evenings was appealing after my unsettling experience on the second night. As Claire settled in and we shared dinner, she listened with polite but obvious skepticism as I described the cabin's rules and my encounter with the mysterious voice in the woods. Her response was exactly what I had expected from someone with an urban background and no experience with mountain folklore. So you're telling me that someone typed up a list of rules about not going outside after dark and not following voices in the woods, and you're taking it seriously? She laughed, but not unkindly. Jonah, these are probably just standard safety guidelines dressed up with spooky language to add atmosphere for city people who rent the place. Don't go outside after dark because you might get lost or injured. Don't wander past the tree line because avalanches are dangerous. Keep the fire burning because the heating system isn't reliable. Her explanations were rational, well-reasoned, and completely aligned with my own initial assessment of the situation. But they failed to account for the specificity of my experience 2 nights earlier. The clarity of the voice calling my name, the precise timing of the door malfunction, and the absolute silence that had followed my response to the calling voice. Claire's attitude toward the rules became a source of gentle but persistent conflict over the next 2 days. She viewed them as an interesting example of rural superstition, worthy of documentation for her photography project, but not of serious adherence. When she heard wind whistling through the trees after dark, she moved to the windows to listen more carefully, intrigued rather than cautioned by the sounds. When she noticed movement in the forest beyond the cabin's lights, she reached for her camera rather than stepping away from the glass. The crisis came on our fourth night together. Following a day when fresh snow had been falling steadily since dawn, Claire had grown restless from being confined to the cabin, and as evening approached, she announced her intention to venture outside with her photography equipment to capture images of the storm. "The lighting is perfect," she explained, assembling her camera gear on the dining room table. "Fresh snow, dramatic clouds, and if I can get up to the tree line, the view down the valley should be spectacular. These are exactly the kinds of shots that magazines pay premium rates for." I reminded her of rule number 2, do not venture past the tree line during or after a snowstorm. But Claire dismissed this with the same confident wave she had used to brush off the other rules. "Jonah, I've been hiking in winter conditions since I was a teenager. I know how to dress appropriately. I have emergency gear and I'll be back before full darkness. This is exactly the kind of calculated risk that professional photographers take all the time." Against my better judgment, I agreed to accompany her, reasoning that 2 people would be safer than 1, and that my presence might encourage her to exercise additional caution. We dressed in multiple layers, checked our emergency supplies, and set out into the storm at approximately 6:30 p.m., giving ourselves what seemed like adequate time to reach the tree line, take photographs, and return before complete darkness fell. The hike began pleasantly enough. The fresh snow created a winter wonderland effect, with heavy flakes clinging to pine branches and creating natural sculptures of extraordinary beauty. Claire was in her element, moving efficiently through the terrain while capturing images with the kind of professional competence that justified her confidence. The storm seemed to be diminishing, and visibility was better than I had expected. But as we climbed higher, approaching the sparse line of trees that marked the transition from forest to alpine terrain, the character of the storm began to change. The wind picked up dramatically, driving snow horizontally across our path and reducing visibility to less than 20 feet. The temperature seemed to drop by degrees every few minutes, and I began to feel genuine concern about our ability to navigate back to the cabin safely. "We should head back," I called to Claire, who was perhaps 30 yards ahead of me, setting up her tripod near a cluster of wind-sculpted pines. "The weather's getting worse and we're losing light faster than I expected." She waved me off, absorbed in composing her shots. "Just 5 more minutes. The light is perfect right now, dramatic but not too dark. These images are going to be incredible." It was then that I heard the whistling, not the random acoustic effects created by wind passing through trees and rocks, but the same structured, purposeful sound I had heard from the cabin's porch 4 nights earlier. Within the general howl of the storm, I could distinguish tones that seemed almost musical, rising and falling in patterns that suggested intention rather than natural occurrence. Claire heard it too. She lowered her camera and turned toward the sound, her expression shifting from professional concentration to fascinated curiosity. "Do you hear that?" she called over the wind. "It's like singing or calling." The whistling grew clearer, more distinct, and I realized with growing horror that it was moving, circling our position in the woods, getting closer with each repetition. And beneath the whistling I could now hear voices. Not the distant, wordless calling I had experienced before, but actual human speech, multiple voices calling our names with increasing urgency. "Claire, Jonah, help us. We're lost." "Can you hear us?" "This way." Follow the voices. Claire took a step toward the sound, then another. Her camera hung forgotten around her neck as she peered into the swirling snow, trying to locate the source of the calls. "There are people out there," she said, her voice tight with concern. "They sound like they're in trouble. We have to help them." But I was remembering rule number 5. Do not follow voices calling from the woods, regardless of familiarity. And something about the voices themselves was wrong. Too clear to be carrying naturally through the storm, too perfectly positioned to be coming from people genuinely in distress. They seemed to surround us completely, calling from multiple directions simultaneously in a way that human beings scattered through a forest could not achieve. "Claire, we need to leave. Now." I grabbed her arm, but she shrugged me off, taking another step toward the tree line. "Listen to them, Jonah. They're scared. They need help." That's when I saw the shadows, not the natural shadows cast by trees and rocks in the dim stormlight, but shapes that moved independently of any objects that should have been casting them, dark forms that flowed across the snow-covered ground like spilled ink. converging on our position from multiple directions with predatory purpose. The voices grew louder, more desperate, but now I could hear the wrongness in them. Subtle distortions in pronunciation, inflections that didn't quite match human speech patterns, and an underlying harmony that suggested they were all being produced by the same source rather than multiple individuals. "Claire," I shouted, but she was already moving away from me, following the voices deeper into the storm and closer to the writhing shadows that waited just beyond the tree line. I saw her stop suddenly, her body going rigid as she stared at something I couldn't see through the swirling snow. Her mouth opened as if to scream, but no sound emerged. Then something grabbed her, not a person, but a darkness that seemed to have physical substance, and pulled her forward into the trees with a motion too fast and too fluid to be natural. I ran toward the spot where she had disappeared, but found only her camera lying in the snow. Its lens cracked and its body twisted, as if it had been subjected to enormous pressure. Beyond that point, the forest was silent except for the howling wind, and the shadows had withdrawn to wherever shadows go when they're not being cast by physical objects. I stumbled back to the cabin through the storm, my mind reeling with the impossibility of what I had witnessed. Claire Morrison had simply vanished, taken by something that lived in the winter woods and hunted using voices and shadows as weapons. The rules I had dismissed as folklore were revealed to be survival instructions, warnings about genuine threats that had been stalking the mountains long before the cabin was built. As I locked the door behind me and built up the fire to drive away the cold that seemed to have penetrated my bones, I understood that my week of isolation and introspection had become something far more dangerous. I was alone on a mountain with something that knew how to mimic human voices, manipulate shadows, and hunt people who broke the rules that protected them from forces beyond rational understanding. Claire's camera bag sat on the dining room table where she had left it, filled with equipment she would never use again to capture images of landscapes she would never see. The morning after Claire's disappearance brought a crystalline clarity to the mountain landscape that seemed to mock the horror of the previous night. Sunlight streamed through the cabin's windows, illuminating a world transformed by fresh snow into something approaching winter perfection. Pristine white slopes punctuated by the dark green of pine trees, and a sky so blue it appeared artificial. It was the kind of scene that photographers traveled thousands of miles to capture, the kind of vista that belonged on calendars and travel brochures advertising the pristine beauty of the Colorado Rockies. But I could no longer see beauty in the landscape without also seeing threat. Every shadow cast by the trees might conceal something predatory. Every distant sound might be the prelude to voices calling from the woods. The rules that had seemed like quaint folklore a week earlier now felt like the only barriers between me and the forces that viewed human beings as acceptable, casualties in some ancient territorial dispute. Spent the morning conducting a methodical search of the cabin, looking for any additional information about the history of the property and the experiences of previous guests. My investigation began with the obvious locations: desk drawers, closets, bookshelves, but gradually expanded to include less conventional hiding places as my desperation for understanding grew. In a storage room adjacent to the kitchen, I discovered a collection of journals and logbooks that previous renters had apparently left behind, either accidentally or intentionally. The books were stored in a wooden crate that had been pushed far back under a workbench, suggesting someone had wanted to preserve them while keeping them out of casual view. The earliest journal was dated 1987 and belonged to a couple from Denver who had rented the cabin for their anniversary. Their entries began with enthusiastic descriptions of mountain hiking and romantic dinners by the fireplace, but the tone shifted dramatically after their third day. November 15th. Something is wrong with this place. We keep hearing voices calling from the woods after dark, and when we went to investigate, Sarah swore she saw her dead sister standing among the trees. The caretaker left us some rules, but they seem ridiculous. Still, after what happened tonight, maybe we should pay attention to them. November 17th, we're leaving tomorrow, cutting the trip short. The voices are getting louder and more frequent, and yesterday I found Sarah standing at the edge of the tree line, talking to someone I couldn't see. She doesn't remember walking there. The rules aren't suggestions. They're warnings about something that lives in these woods. A journal from 1993 contained similar accounts, written by a solo hiker who had intended to spend 2 weeks photographing wildlife, day 6. The rules make sense now. I broke the first one last night, went outside after sunset to photograph the aurora, and something followed me back to the cabin. I could hear it moving around the building all night, testing the doors and windows. When I looked out this morning, there were tracks in the snow that didn't match any animal I know. Day 8. I'm leaving today. Found more tracks this morning, and they're getting closer to the cabin. Some look human, but the stride is too long and the foot shape is wrong. The caretaker was right. These rules aren't about comfort or convenience. They're about survival. But the most disturbing journal belonged to a writer named David Chen, who had stayed at the cabin during the winter of 1998. His entries documented a gradual descent from skepticism to terror that mirrored my own experience. January 12th. Broke rule number 3 tonight. Heard what sounded like my ex-wife calling for help from the woods. When I called back, the voice answered with things about our marriage that no one else could know. The door locked behind me when I stepped outside to investigate. Something is using personal information to lure people into the forest. January 18th. Found photographs hidden under the floorboards in the back bedroom. Pictures of people who've stayed here over the years. Some of the photos show guests smiling and relaxed, but others, the people in the later photos, have something wrong with their eyes. They look empty, hollow, like they're looking at something beyond the camera that they can't escape. January 22nd. I understand now. The thing in the woods doesn't just hunt people, it studies them. It learns their voices, their memories, their fears. Each person it takes makes it more effective at hunting the next person. I'm leaving tomorrow if I can make it down the mountain road. David Chen's final entry was dated January 23rd, but it consisted of only a single line. It's calling my name in my own voice. How is that possible? I found the photographs Chen had mentioned, hidden beneath loose floorboards in the cabin's smaller bedroom. The pictures appeared to span several decades, showing guests in various seasonal settings around the cabin property. The earlier photographs were conventional tourist shots, people posing on the porch, hiking in the woods, enjoying meals by the fireplace. But as I progressed chronologically through the collection, I began to notice the change Chen had described. The subjects in the later photographs looked increasingly uncomfortable, their smiles forced, and their eyes carrying an expression of barely controlled fear. Some appeared to be looking at something beyond the photographer's position, their gazes fixed on some distant threat. The most recent photographs were the most disturbing. The people in these images weren't smiling at all. Their faces were pale and drawn, their eyes wide with terror that suggested they had seen something that fundamentally challenged their understanding of reality. Some appeared to be backing away from the camera, as if trying to escape whatever they were seeing. At the bottom of the collection, I found a photograph that stopped my investigation entirely. It showed Claire Morrison standing on the cabin's front porch, but it had clearly been taken after our arrival. She was wearing the same clothes I remembered from our hike to the tree line, but her expression was one of absolute horror. Her mouth was open in what might have been a scream, and her eyes were fixed on something behind the camera's position with an intensity that suggested mortal terror. But I had never taken this photograph. No one had taken this photograph. Claire and I had been the only people at the cabin since her arrival, and neither of us owned the kind of instant camera that would have produced this type of print. I examined the photograph more closely and noticed something that made my hands shake. The shadows in the image were wrong, not just in their positioning but in their very nature. Where Claire's shadow should have fallen across the porch boards, there was instead a dark shape that didn't correspond to her body position. The shadow appeared to be reaching toward her with appendages that were too long and too numerous to be human. I sealed the photographs back in their hiding place and spent the rest of the day reviewing the journal entries, looking for patterns or clues that might help me understand what I was dealing with. The accounts were consistent in their description of an entity that inhabited the winter woods around the cabin, something that used mimicry and psychological manipulation to lure people into violating the protective rules that had been established through generations of trial and tragic error. But the journals also suggested something even more disturbing. The entity was learning from each encounter, becoming more sophisticated in its hunting techniques as it absorbed the knowledge and personalities of its victims. Claire's disappearance hadn't just eliminated a threat to my own safety. It had provided the entity with new tools for future attacks. As darkness fell, and I checked the locks on all doors and windows, I realized that I was no longer just following rules to avoid an abstract supernatural threat. I was engaged in an active psychological war with something that now knew Claire's voice, her mannerisms, her concerns about my safety and well-being. It had gained the ability to impersonate someone I cared about, someone whose pleas for help I would find almost impossible to ignore. The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows on the cabin walls that seemed to move with too much independence from the flames that created them. Outside, the wind was beginning to pick up, and I knew that soon I would hear the whistling that announced another night of siege. I sat in the cabin's main room with the rules spread on the table before me, no longer viewing them as guidelines, but as tactical instructions for a battle I was only beginning to understand. Somewhere in the woods beyond the windows, Claire's voice was waiting to call my name with perfect familiarity, and I would have to find the strength to ignore her pleas no matter how desperate they sounded. The photographs had taught me that survival wasn't just about following the rules, it was about maintaining the psychological discipline to follow them, even when doing so felt like a betrayal of everything decent and human within me. The knock came at 2:17 a.m. on my 7th night alone at the cabin, shattering the tense quiet I had maintained since Claire's disappearance 3 days earlier. I was sitting by the fireplace, feeding split logs into the flames and trying to concentrate on my writing, despite the constant low-level dread that had become my default emotional state. The sound was unmistakably human, knuckles rapping against wood with the measured persistence of someone accustomed to being answered. My first instinct was relief. Another person, another human being who could provide company and perhaps assistance in dealing with the situation I had discovered in the mountain woods. But as I rose from my chair and moved toward the door, rule number 7 flashed in my memory. If something knocks after midnight, do not answer. I approached the front door cautiously and peered through the frosted glass panels that flanked the entrance. A dark figure stood on the porch, barely visible in the light cast by the cabin's exterior fixtures. The shape was human in size and proportion, but the details were obscured by shadow and the distorting effect of the textured glass. The knocking resumed, patient but insistent, and I heard a voice I recognized, Avery Hartwell. The cabin's caretaker, Mr. West? Jonah, I know you're in there. I need to talk to you. The voice was exactly as I remembered it, gravelly, weathered, carrying the authority of someone who had spent decades dealing with mountain emergencies and tourist crises. But Avery's presence at the cabin after midnight violated every protocol he had established during my initial briefing. He had specifically mentioned that he would check on guests during daylight hours and only in cases of genuine emergency. Avery? I called through the door. Is everything all right? What are you doing here so late? There's been an incident in the valley. Missing hikers. Search and rescue needs to know if you've seen anything unusual in the past few days. His response was immediate and plausible, the kind of emergency that would justify a middle-of-the-night visit from local authorities or search personnel. But I remembered Claire's disappearance, and I remembered the photographs hidden beneath the cabin's floorboards. I also remembered the journal entries describing an entity that used familiar voices to manipulate its victims into violating the protective rules that kept them safe. Can you come back in the morning, Avery? I'm not supposed to open the door after midnight. House rules. A long pause during which I could hear wind moving through the pine trees and the soft hiss of snow falling on the cabin's metal roof. When Avery's voice resumed, it carried a note of weary understanding that seemed genuine. Smart man. You've been reading the journals, haven't you? Found the photographs. Another pause. All right, Mr. West, I'll wait until sunrise. But we need to talk, and it can't wait much longer. The figure on the porch moved away from the door, and I watched through the window as it settled onto one of the wooden chairs that flanked the entrance. For the remaining hours until dawn, I could see the dark silhouette sitting motionless on the porch, occasionally turning its head to scan the surrounding forest, but otherwise remaining perfectly still. At first light, I unlocked the door and found Avery Hartwell exactly where he had positioned himself 6 hours earlier. But the man who rose from the porch chair looked significantly older and more worn than the person who had given me the cabin tour a week earlier. His face was gaunt, his eyes were bloodshot and deeply shadowed, and his movements carried the careful deliberation of someone operating on very little sleep. "Thank you for following the rules," he said, as I invited him inside. Not everyone has the discipline to ignore a familiar voice after midnight, especially when it's asking for help with something that sounds legitimate. As Avery settled into a chair by the fireplace, I noticed details about his appearance that I had missed during our initial meeting. His winter clothing was worn and patched in multiple places, suggesting equipment that had seen heavy use over many seasons. His hands showed the kind of deep scarring that comes from frequent exposure to extreme cold, and his left ear had the waxy, discolored appearance of old frostbite damage. "How long have you really been the caretaker here, Avery?" He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if the flames contained information I couldn't access. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of exhaustion that seemed to encompass far more than just a single sleepless night. "Officially? About 15 years. Unofficially?" He gestured vaguely toward the windows that looked out on the forest. "I've been fighting this thing for longer than I care to remember. My father was the caretaker before me, and his father before him. This isn't a job, Mr. West, it's a calling." "What exactly is out there, Avery? What happened to Claire?" "I don't know what it is exactly. Something old. Something that was here before the cabin, before the logging roads, probably before the first European settlers came through these mountains. The indigenous peoples had names for it. Warnings about certain areas that should be avoided during winter months. But those warnings got lost when the old-timers died off, and the young folks moved to the cities." Avery pulled off his wool cap and ran gnarled fingers through his grey hair. "What I do know is that it feeds on people. Not their bodies, but something else. Their voices, their memories, their personalities. Each person it takes makes it stronger, gives it new tools for hunting the next victim. The journals mention that it's learning, becoming more sophisticated over time. That's right. 50 years ago it could barely manage simple mimicry, wind sounds that almost resembled voices, shadows that moved wrong but not obviously wrong. Now it can reproduce specific people's voices with perfect accuracy, create complex scenarios designed to exploit individual psychological vulnerabilities, even generate physical evidence like photographs that shouldn't exist." The implications were terrifying. If the entity continued to evolve its hunting techniques at the same rate, the rules that had protected previous generations of cabin guests might eventually become insufficient against a predator that understood human nature better than humans understood themselves. "Why do you stay, Avery? Why not just shut down the cabin, post warning signs, let the forest reclaim the area?" His laugh was bitter and hollow. "Because it doesn't just hunt people who stay at the cabin, Mr. West. It hunts anyone who enters its territory during the vulnerable months. Hikers, skiers, hunters, search and rescue personnel, they all become potential victims if they don't understand the rules. The cabin serves as a focal point, a place where people can learn what they're dealing with before they encounter it unprepared in the wilderness. So the cabin is bait. The cabin is education. The people who follow the rules and complete their stays without incident go back to the cities with knowledge about mountain safety that they share with other outdoor enthusiasts. They become part of an informal network that helps protect people who might otherwise stumble into this area without any understanding of what they're facing." Avery stood up and moved to the window, looking out at the forest with the expression of someone who had spent years studying a dangerous opponent. "The people who break the rules, well, they serve a different purpose. They satisfy the entity's hunger for a while, buying time for others to learn and spread the warnings." The cold pragmatism of his statement was shocking, but I understood the logic behind it. If the entity couldn't be defeated or driven away, then the best possible outcome was managing its impact on human populations through education and controlled exposure. "What about Claire? Is there any chance she's still alive out there?" Avery's reflection in the window glass looked infinitely sad. "No, Mr. West. Once it takes someone, they don't come back. But their voices do, and their memories and their knowledge about the people who cared about them. You need to understand that when you hear Claire calling your name from the woods tonight, and you will hear her, it won't be Claire asking for help. It will be the thing that took her, using her voice as a weapon against your judgment." He turned back to face me, and I saw in his eyes the kind of weariness that comes from carrying terrible knowledge for too long. The hardest part of following the rules isn't ignoring strange sounds or avoiding dark forests. It's ignoring the voices of people you care about when they beg you to break the rules that keep you safe. The entity knows this, and it uses our compassion against us. How do you bear it? How do you live with the knowledge that people are dying? Because you're not warning them more explicitly. Because more people would die if I did. Avery pulled his cap back on and zipped up his jacket. Explicit warnings about supernatural threats get dismissed as crazy mountain folklore. People have to discover the truth gradually, the way you did, or they'll never take the precautions seriously enough to survive. The rules work because they seem like reasonable safety guidelines until experience proves there's something more. He moved toward the door, then paused with his hand on the knob. Mr. West, you've got two choices now. You can finish out your rental period by following the rules exactly. Then leave with knowledge that might help you protect other people in similar situations. Or you can try to fight this thing, try to rescue Claire, try to be the hero who defeats an ancient evil through determination and modern thinking. What happens if I choose the second option? Then your voice joins the chorus that calls from the woods, and the entity gains new tools for hunting whoever comes here next. He opened the door and stepped onto the porch. The rules aren't about cowardice, Mr. West. They're about recognizing when you're outmatched and choosing tactical retreat over heroic failure. After Avery's truck disappeared down the mountain road, I sat by the fire and contemplated the choice he had presented. I could complete my stay as a survivor, or I could attempt a rescue that would almost certainly result in my own destruction. Both options felt like betrayals, of Claire's memory or of my own moral principles. As darkness fell and I heard the first faint whistles beginning to echo through the trees, I realized that the entity had already begun its psychological assault for the night. Soon I would hear Claire's voice calling my name with perfect accuracy, begging me to ignore the rules and come to her aid in the forest. And I would have to find the strength to sit by the fire and let her pleas go unanswered. Knowing that my survival depended on embracing a form of moral cowardice that contradicted everything I had believed about human decency and mutual responsibility. The rules demanded not just obedience, but the acceptance of a worldview where some battles couldn't be won and some people couldn't be saved. The assault on my psychological defenses began at sunset on my 8th night alone at the cabin, earlier than the entity had previously attempted its manipulations. As the last light faded from the western sky and the forest settled into the deep shadows that marked the beginning of another siege, I heard Claire's voice calling from the woods with heartbreaking clarity. "Jonah? Jonah, please, I'm so cold. I'm hurt and I can't find my way back." The voice was perfect, not just in its reproduction of Claire's vocal patterns and inflection, but in its emotional authenticity. She sounded genuinely frightened, genuinely desperate, with the kind of raw panic that cuts through rational thought and triggers immediate protective responses. Every instinct developed through 34 years of socialization screamed that I should respond, that ignoring someone's plea for help was a fundamental violation of human decency. But I forced myself to remain seated by the fireplace, feeding logs into the flames with mechanical precision, while Claire's voice grew more desperate outside the cabin walls. Avery's warnings echoed in my memory. It won't be Claire asking for help. It will be the thing that took her, using her voice as a weapon against your judgment. I can see the cabin lights, Jonah. I'm so close, but I'm too weak to make it on my own. Please just help me get inside where it's warm. The manipulation was sophisticated, designed to exploit not just my concern for Claire's welfare, but my guilt about her disappearance. The entity understood that I blamed myself for agreeing to the hike that had led to her capture, and it was using that self-recrimination as leverage to override my adherence to the protective rules. As the hours passed, the psychological pressure intensified. Claire's voice was joined by others, people I had known throughout my life, all calling my name from the darkness beyond the windows. My father, who had died in a car accident when I was 16, my college roommate, Marcus, who had been killed in Afghanistan 3 years after graduation, Sarah, my ex-girlfriend, pleading with me to come outside so we could reconcile our relationship. But it was Claire's voice that carried the most emotional weight, and the entity seemed to understand this. Her pleas became more specific, more personally targeted, incorporating details about our brief relationship that no external observer could have known. Remember what I told you about my sister's accident, Jonah? How I've always blamed myself for not being there to help her. Don't let me die the same way she did. Don't let guilt be the only thing you have left of me. The reference was accurate. During one of our evening conversations by the fireplace, Claire had mentioned her younger sister's death in a skiing accident and the survivor's guilt that had motivated her to become a professional photographer, specializing in wilderness landscapes. The entity had absorbed not just Claire's voice and appearance, but her memories and emotional experiences as well. At approximately 2 a.m., the voices stopped calling my name and began speaking to each other, creating the illusion of a conversation taking place just outside the cabin walls. I could hear Claire talking with my father, discussing my personality and psychological vulnerabilities with the kind of intimate knowledge that comes from close personal relationships. He's stubborn, but he's not heartless, Claire's voice said. If he thinks we're suffering out here, really suffering, he'll come to help us regardless of those silly rules. The boy always did have too much conscience for his own good, my father's voice replied. Remember when he was 12 and tried to rescue that injured hawk? Nearly got himself killed climbing the tree, but he couldn't stand to see something in pain. The conversation was designed to make me feel like the people I had lost were still present, still aware of my struggles, still capable of being helped, if I could only overcome my adherence to arbitrary supernatural protocols. It was a masterfully constructed psychological trap that targeted my deepest emotional vulnerabilities with surgical precision. But the most devastating attack came near dawn, when the voices fell silent for several minutes before Claire spoke again, this time from directly outside my bedroom window, so close that she might have been pressed against the glass. Jonah, I need to tell you something before it's too late. I'm pregnant. The words hit me like a physical blow. Claire and I had been intimate during her stay at the cabin, and while we had been careful, no contraceptive method was completely reliable. The possibility that she might be carrying my child, that her death had also meant the death of my unborn son or daughter, added a dimension of moral urgency that threatened to overwhelm my rational defenses entirely. I wanted to tell you before, but I wasn't sure how you'd react. I was going to take a test when I got back to Boulder, but now... Jonah, please don't let our baby die out here in the cold. Don't let us both die because you're too afraid to break some meaningless rules. I found myself standing at the bedroom window, hands pressed against the glass, staring out into the darkness where Claire's voice originated. The frosted panes showed only my own reflection and the warm glow of the cabin's interior lights, but I could hear her breathing, could almost feel her presence just beyond the barrier of glass and wood that separated us. The entity had found my breaking point. I could ignore pleas for personal rescue, could resist appeals to friendship and romantic attachment, could even withstand the emotional manipulation of hearing dead relatives call my name. But the possibility that I was condemning an unborn child to death by following the rules pushed my psychological defenses beyond their limits. Was reaching for the window latch when I remembered the photograph I had found hidden beneath the floorboards, the image of Claire on the cabin's porch, her face twisted with terror as she stared at something behind the camera's position. The photograph that showed shadows reaching toward her, with appendages that were too long and too numerous to be human. Claire was already dead. She had died 3 nights ago when the shadows took her past the tree line. Whatever was speaking outside my window might have her voice and her memories, but it wasn't her, and it certainly wasn't carrying our child. It was a predator, using the most sophisticated psychological manipulation I had ever encountered, targeting the specific emotional triggers that would override my survival instincts. I backed away from the window and returned to the main room, where I built up the fire and tried to block out the continuing pleas from outside. But the damage was done. The entity had demonstrated that it could exploit not just my conscious fears and guilt, but my unconscious desires and hopes as well. It understood human psychology at a level that made the protective rules seem inadequate against its evolving hunting techniques. For the remaining hours until sunrise, I sat by the fireplace and wrestled with the moral implications of my situation. By following the rules, I was ensuring my own survival but potentially abandoning people who might genuinely need help. By breaking the rules, I would almost certainly be captured by an entity that would use my voice and memories to hunt future victims with even greater effectiveness. The choice wasn't between heroism and cowardice, it was between accepting the limitations of human capability in the face of supernatural predation, or allowing pride and conscience to transform me into a weapon that would be used against other innocent people. As dawn broke over the mountains and the voices finally fell silent, I understood that I had reached the point of no return in my psychological battle with the entity in the woods. It had shown me the full extent of its manipulative capabilities, and I had demonstrated that I could resist even its most sophisticated attacks on my moral convictions. But I also knew that each night's assault was building toward something larger, something that would test not just my adherence to the rules, but my fundamental capacity to maintain rational thought under supernatural pressure. The entity was patient, intelligent, and learning from each encounter, and it still had 5 more nights to break me before my rental period ended, and I could escape to the safety of human civilization. My final night at the Hartwell cabin began with an ominous change in the weather patterns that had governed the mountain environment for the previous 2 weeks. The steady snowfall that had characterized my entire stay suddenly stopped, leaving behind a crystalline silence that felt more threatening than the constant whisper of wind through pine branches. The temperature plummeted to what the cabin's thermometer registered as -18 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that the windows developed frost patterns on their interior surfaces, despite the cabin's heating system. But the most disturbing change was in the fire itself. Despite my careful attention to feeding split logs into the stone hearth throughout the day, the flames had been growing progressively weaker since sunset. By 10 p.m., what should have been a robust blaze capable of heating the cabin's main room had dwindled to a collection of glowing embers that provided more psychological comfort than actual warmth. I had been expecting this crisis. The journal entries I had discovered made multiple references to the entity's ability to interfere with the cabin's heating systems during the final nights of guests' stays, creating conditions that would force them to choose between freezing to death inside the cabin or venturing outside to gather additional firewood from the shed located 20 yards behind the building. The shed itself was positioned in a location that required violating multiple rules simultaneously. Reaching it meant going outside after sundown, moving beyond the protective circle of the cabin's exterior lights, and venturing into the forest where shadows moved with predatory intelligence. It was a perfect trap, designed to exploit the basic human need for warmth and shelter by making survival dependent on actions that would result in capture by the entity. By midnight, the fire had died to the point where my breath was visible in the cabin's main room, and frost was beginning to form on the interior walls. The backup heating system, which should have activated automatically when the temperature dropped below a preset threshold, remained stubbornly offline despite my attempts to restart it, using the controls Avery had shown me during my initial tour. I wrapped myself in every available blanket and tried to maintain body heat through constant movement, but I knew that hypothermia would begin affecting my judgment and motor functions within hours if I couldn't restore adequate heating to the cabin. The entity had created a situation where following the rules meant accepting certain death from exposure, while breaking them offered the possibility of survival through active resistance. At 1:30 a.m., I heard Claire's voice calling from the direction of the woodshed, but this time her words carried a different kind of urgency. "Jonah, I found firewood. There's plenty here, enough to keep you warm all night. I'm bringing some to the cabin now." The offer was seductive not just because it promised warmth, but because it suggested a solution that didn't require me to leave the safety of the cabin or violate any of the protective rules. If Claire could bring firewood to me, I could maintain the fire without exposing myself to whatever waited in the darkness beyond the cabin's lights. But I knew that Claire was dead, and I knew that whatever was speaking with her voice was attempting to lure me into opening the door by offering assistance rather than demanding rescue. The psychological sophistication of the approach was remarkable. Instead of exploiting my guilt or compassion, it was targeting my desperation and my desire to find a solution that didn't require heroic risk-taking. The door's heavy. "Jonah, I can't manage it with my arms full of wood. "Can you help me get inside?" I remained seated by the dying fire, even as the cold began to penetrate my multiple layers of clothing, and I started to experience the early stages of hypothermia, confusion, drowsiness, and a dangerous desire to simply lie down and stop fighting against the inevitable. Opening the door would mean warmth and the possibility of survival. Keeping it locked would mean accepting death by freezing while following rules that might not be adequate protection against an entity that had been studying human behavior for decades. The choice became even more difficult when I heard additional voices joining Claire's calls from outside the cabin. Avery's voice offering to help with the heating system. My father's voice, promising that everything would be all right if I would just let him inside. Sarah's voice, apologizing for our breakup and expressing her desire to reconcile our relationship before it was too late. But beneath the familiar voices, I began to detect something else. A low, constant whisper that seemed to come from the cabin's walls themselves. Not words exactly, but a sound like wind moving through spaces that shouldn't exist within the building structure. As I listened more carefully, the whisper resolved into something that might have been breathing, or might have been the collective voices of everyone. The entity had captured over the decades it had been hunting in these mountains. The sound was coming from the fireplace. I approached the stone hearth and listened to the whisper echoing up through the chimney from some source deep below the cabin's foundation. The entity wasn't just outside the building, it was underneath it, speaking through the very infrastructure that was supposed to provide warmth and safety. The fireplace, which had seemed like a reliable source of heat and light, was actually a conduit that allowed the entity direct access to the cabin's interior. The implications were terrifying. If the entity could influence the cabin's heating systems and communicate through the fireplace, then the building itself might not provide the protection I had assumed it offered. The rules about staying inside after dark and keeping doors locked might be inadequate against a threat that could penetrate the cabin's defenses through architectural features that couldn't be secured. As if responding to my realization, the whispers from the fireplace grew louder and more distinct. I could make out individual voices now, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking in the overlapping harmony that the entity used when it wasn't bothering to maintain the illusion of separate human speakers. "Let us in. Jonah, open the door, Jonah. Join us. Jonah? It's warm down here, Jonah." The voices were calling from below the cabin now, from whatever space the entity occupied beneath the mountain's frozen ground. They weren't trying to lure me outside anymore. They were inviting me to come down, to descend through the fireplace into the darkness, where Claire and all the other victims waited, in whatever state of existence the entity had imposed upon them. I backed away from the hearth, but the whispers followed me, seeming to emerge from the walls and floors and ceiling as the entity demonstrated its ability to penetrate every part of the cabin's structure. The building that had seemed like a fortress against supernatural predation was revealed to be more like a trap, designed to concentrate victims in a location where the entity could apply maximum psychological pressure while offering no genuine protection. At 3 a.m., the whispers stopped, and the cabin fell silent except for the sound of my own breathing and the rapid beating of my heart. The temperature continued to drop, and I knew that I had perhaps 2 hours before hypothermia progressed to the point where I would lose the ability to think clearly or make rational decisions about my situation. That's when I heard a new sound, footsteps on the cabin's roof, not the random impact of falling snow or ice, but the deliberate rhythm of something large moving across the metal surface with careful measured steps. The footsteps circled the building once, twice, then stopped directly above the main room where I was sitting. A piece of burning wood fell down the chimney and landed on the stone hearth, followed by another, then another. Someone or something was dropping fuel down the chimney from the roof, providing the fire with new material just when I was most desperate for warmth. But the wood was wrong. Instead of the familiar orange and yellow flames I had been maintaining for 2 weeks, these new logs burned with a cold blue light that provided no heat, despite their apparent combustion. The fire grew larger and brighter, but the cabin's temperature continued to drop, and I realized that the entity was offering me a choice between freezing to death and accepting warmth from a source that would transform me into something else entirely. The blue flames danced in the stone fireplace, beautiful and mesmerizing and completely unnatural. I could feel their cold radiance on my face, and I understood that stepping closer would mean accepting the entity's invitation to join Claire and the other victims in whatever existence they had found beneath the mountain. Instead, I moved to the cabin's front door and put my hand on the lock mechanism. If I was going to die, it would be on my own terms, following my own choices, rather than accepting the false alternatives the entity was offering. I would step outside into the killing cold and take my chances in the forest, rather than surrender to a predator that had been perfecting its hunting techniques for longer than human memory could record. But as I reached for the door handle, I heard Avery's voice calling from the porch, not the manipulative mimicry the entity had been using, but the actual voice of the actual man who had been fighting this thing for decades. "Mr. West, step away from the door. Don't go outside and don't get near that fire. There's a third option." Avery Hartwell's voice carried an authority that cut through the psychological chaos the entity had been orchestrating throughout the night. I stepped back from the door and listened as he continued speaking from the cabin's front porch, his words muffled by the thick walls and windows, but still clearly audible. "The blue fire is a gateway, Mr. West. Don't get close to it. Don't let it touch you, and whatever you do, don't look directly into the flames for more than a few seconds at a time. Can you hear me?" "I can hear you, Avery," I called back. "Are you really out there, or is this another trick?" "I'm here. Been waiting in the tree line since sunset, watching for the signs that told me tonight would be different from the others." The entity always makes its strongest play during the final night of a guest stay, when desperation overrides caution and people start making fatal mistakes. Through the cabin's front window, I could see a figure moving on the porch, too solid and three-dimensional to be one of the entity's shadow projections, carrying equipment that reflected the pale light from the dying fire. Avery was dressed for extreme cold weather and appeared to be setting up some kind of device near the cabin's entrance. "What's the third option?" I asked. "Survival through preparation rather than improvisation. The entity can interfere with the cabin's heating systems, but it can't prevent properly prepared emergency equipment from functioning. I've got a portable propane heater out here, along with enough fuel to keep you warm until sunrise. All you have to do is unlock the door and step back while I bring it inside." The offer sounded reasonable, but after 2 weeks of psychological manipulation, I had learned to question every apparently helpful suggestion. "How do I know you're really Avery, and not another voice the entity is using?" "Because I'm going to tell you something the entity wouldn't know. Something I never told you during your initial briefing." A pause, during which I could hear him working with metal equipment in the cold air. "My real name isn't Avery Hartwell. It's Daniel Morrison. Avery Hartwell was my predecessor as caretaker, and he died in 1987 when he tried to rescue a family that got caught in the woods after a snowstorm. I took his identity to maintain continuity for the rental agency and the local authorities. The revelation was startling, but it carried the ring of authenticity that the entity's mimicry had always lacked. The information was too specific, too personally compromising, and too unrelated to my own psychological vulnerabilities to be part of a manipulation designed to lure me outside. Why didn't you tell me this before? Because people need to believe that the caretaker position is stable, that there's institutional knowledge and long-term experience protecting them. If every guest knew that caretakers regularly die fighting this thing, nobody would take the rental seriously enough to follow the rules that keep them alive. I unlocked the front door and stepped back as Avery, Daniel, carried a compact propane heater into the cabin's main room. He was exactly as I remembered him, but now I could see details that I had missed during our previous encounters. The way he constantly scanned the shadows, the manner in which he positioned himself to maintain lines of sight to all exits, and the collection of unusual equipment he carried that had nothing to do with standard mountain rescue operations. "How many caretakers have there been?" I asked as he connected the heater to a fuel cylinder and adjusted the flame to provide steady, natural warmth that immediately began to counteract the supernatural cold that had been draining my body heat. 7 that I know of, probably more before record-keeping became reliable. The position doesn't attract people who are interested in long-term employment. He glanced toward the fireplace, where the blue flames continued to dance without providing heat. Each caretaker learns a little more about how to fight this thing effectively, and that knowledge gets passed on to whoever takes over when they don't come back from a rescue attempt. What happened to the family Avery tried to help? Same thing that happened to Claire Morrison. Same thing that happens to everyone who breaks the rules or gets caught. In the woods during the entity's hunting season, Daniel moved to the fireplace and began working with a device that looked like a combination fire extinguisher and vacuum cleaner. But their sacrifice taught me that direct confrontation with the entity is always fatal, and that survival depends on understanding its limitations rather than trying to overcome its strengths. As he activated the device, the blue flames were drawn into its collection chamber, like liquid being suctioned through a straw. The unnatural fire disappeared entirely, leaving behind only the normal red glow of smoldering embers and the reassuring warmth of the propane heater. The entity can only maintain its strongest manifestations for limited periods, Daniel explained, as he sealed the collection chamber and stowed the device in his equipment pack. The blue fire, the shadow projections, the voice mimicry, they all require enormous energy expenditure. Dawn is only 3 hours away, and it's already exhausted from tonight's assault. It'll retreat to whatever space it occupies beneath the mountain and remain dormant until the next hunting season. When is the next hunting season? Late fall through early spring, when snow cover is heavy enough to mask its tracks, and cold temperatures weaken people's resistance to hypothermia. During summer months it's still present but much less active. Hikers and campers occasionally report strange sounds or unexplained equipment failures, but direct attacks are extremely rare. As the morning progressed and natural light began filtering through the cabin's frost-covered windows, I felt the psychological pressure that had been building for 2 weeks finally beginning to lift. The constant sense of being watched, the hypervigilance that had made sleep difficult and concentration impossible, the low-level dread that had colored every aspect of my daily routine, all of it faded with the sunrise like fog dissipating in warm air. But I knew that the relief was temporary. Even if I completed my rental period and returned to civilization, the knowledge I had gained about the entity's capabilities would remain with me permanently. I would never again be able to enjoy wilderness solitude without wondering what might be watching from the shadows. I would never hear wind whistling through trees without listening for voices hidden within the sound. Does it get easier? I asked Daniel as we prepared for my departure later that morning. Living with the knowledge that something like this exists? No, he said simply, but it gets more manageable. You learn to recognize the signs, to trust your instincts about places and situations that feel wrong. Most importantly, you learn to share the knowledge in ways that help other people stay safe without sounding like a lunatic who's been spending too much time alone in the mountains. Daniel helped me load my belongings into my Honda and provided a final briefing about mountain safety that would serve as cover for the real information he was conveying. To any outside observer, we were simply discussing standard precautions about weather monitoring, emergency equipment, and communication protocols. But embedded within the conventional advice were specific warnings about the signs that indicated supernatural activity in wilderness areas. Remember, he said as I started the engine and began the careful descent down the mountain road, the most important rule isn't written on any list. Trust your instincts about people and places that feel wrong, even if you can't articulate why. Evolution gave us those instincts for good reasons. As I drove away from the Hartwell cabin, I could see Daniel in my rearview mirror, standing on the porch and watching my departure, with the expression of someone who had successfully completed another difficult assignment. But I also noticed that he didn't enter the cabin or begin preparing it for the next guest. Instead, he gathered his equipment and walked toward his truck, as if the building itself had become contaminated by the night's events. I understood then that my stay at the cabin had been more than just a rental period. It had been a test, a controlled exposure to supernatural forces under conditions where experienced help was available if I proved capable of following the protective protocols. Daniel had been monitoring my progress throughout my stay, ready to intervene if I demonstrated the discipline necessary to survive, encounter with the entity, but needed assistance to complete the experience successfully. The drive back to Denver took 6 hours through mountain terrain. That looked completely different in daylight. than it had during my arrival 2 weeks earlier. The forests that had seemed threatening and alien now appeared merely wild, the kind of rugged landscape that attracted photographers and hikers seeking authentic wilderness experiences. But I knew that appearances were deceptive, that the entity was still present beneath the snow and shadows, waiting patiently for the next person who would ignore the rules that protected them from forces beyond rational understanding. I returned to my apartment with more than just material for the book I had intended to write. I had gained knowledge about the thin places in the world where ancient predators continued to hunt, using methods that human civilization had forgotten how to recognize or defend against. The rules I had learned weren't just applicable to a single mountain cabin, they were general principles for surviving encounters with forces that viewed human beings as acceptable casualties in territorial disputes that had been ongoing since before recorded history. That night, sleeping in my own bed surrounded by the familiar sounds of urban life, I dreamed of blue flames dancing in stone fireplaces and voices calling from forests that had no beginning and no end. But I also dreamed of Daniel Morrison and the other caretakers, who had chosen to stand guard at the boundary between civilization and wilderness, ensuring that at least some people would survive to carry forward the knowledge necessary to recognize and avoid supernatural predation. The rules had kept me alive, but they had also changed me in ways I was only beginning to understand. I was no longer just a journalist seeking material for a career salvaging book. I had become part of an informal network of people who understood that some threats couldn't be defeated through conventional means, only managed through careful adherence to protocols developed through generations of trial and tragic error. And somewhere in the Colorado Rockies, another guest was probably receiving their first briefing about the Hartwell cabin's house rules, beginning their own journey toward the kind of knowledge that couldn't be unlearned once it was acquired. 3 months after my return to Denver, I received an email that confirmed my worst fears about the ongoing cycle of predation at the Hartwell cabin. The message was brief and professional, sent from the vacation rental website where I had originally found the listing. Dear Mr. West, we hope you enjoyed your stay at the Hartwell cabin. A new guest will be arriving next week for an extended winter retreat, and we wanted to follow up on your experience to ensure we're providing optimal service to our customers. If you have any feedback about the property or its amenities, please don't hesitate to contact us. Attached to the email was a guest information form for someone named Michael Chen, a 29-year-old software developer from San Francisco who had booked the cabin for a 3-week digital detox retreat. According to his rental application, Michael was seeking complete isolation from technology and urban life to focus on meditation and creative writing. He had no experience with mountain living, no knowledge of wilderness safety protocols, and no understanding of what he was about to encounter in the Colorado Rockies. I called the rental agency immediately and asked to speak with whoever was responsible for guest orientation and safety briefings. After being transferred through multiple departments, I finally reached a customer service representative who seemed genuinely puzzled by my concerns. All of our mountain properties include comprehensive safety information, she assured me. Guests receive detailed instructions about weather monitoring, emergency communication procedures, and local regulations. We also provide contact information for the property caretaker, who's available to assist with any problems that might arise. What about the house rules? The specific protocols that previous guests have found necessary for their safety? A pause during which I could hear computer keys clicking. I see that you're referring to some kind of supplementary documentation provided by the local caretaker. That would be outside our standard rental procedures, but property managers are encouraged to share relevant local knowledge with guests at their discretion. The conversation confirmed what I had suspected. The vacation rental agency had no official knowledge of the supernatural threats surrounding the Hartwell cabin, and the protective rules were maintained through an informal system that depended entirely on individual caretakers' willingness to warn incoming guests. If something happened to Daniel Morrison, or if he decided that the risks of continuing his role outweighed the benefits, future guests would arrive at the cabin with no protection beyond their own instincts and whatever warnings they might discover in the journals hidden throughout the building. I spent the rest of the day researching Michael Chen through social media and professional networking sites, trying to develop a psychological profile that might help me predict how he would respond to the challenges he was about to face. What I found was troubling. Michael appeared to be someone who approached problems through technological solutions and rational analysis. Exactly the kind of person who would dismiss the cabin's rules as primitive superstition that had no relevance to a well-educated urban professional. His social media posts revealed a personality that valued innovation, efficiency, and evidence-based decision-making. He had written extensively about the importance of questioning traditional assumptions and developing new approaches to old problems. His professional background was in software security, where success depended on identifying and exploiting weaknesses in systems that other people assumed were secure. In other words, Michael Chen was exactly the kind of person who would view the cabin's protective rules as a challenge to be overcome rather than wisdom to be respected. His natural inclination would be to test the boundaries, to experiment with violations, to prove through direct experience that the restrictions were unnecessary. I tried calling Michael directly, using contact information from his rental application, but my calls went straight to voicemail. When I finally reached him 3 days later, his response to my warnings was exactly what I had expected. "Thanks for reaching out, Jonah, but I think you might be taking the local folklore a bit too seriously. I've done extensive research on the property and the surrounding area, and while there are certainly valid safety concerns about winter mountain conditions, the supernatural elements you're describing sound like classic urban legends designed to add atmosphere for tourists. Michael, I'm not talking about folklore. I'm talking about direct personal experience with something that hunts people who ignore the protective protocols. Please just follow the rules exactly as they're written, even if they seem arbitrary or superstitious. I appreciate your concern, really, but I'm planning to use this retreat as an opportunity to practice rational decision-making under challenging conditions. Part of that involves distinguishing between legitimate safety precautions and psychological manipulation designed to create artificial limitations. The conversation continued for 20 minutes, but it became clear that Michael had already decided to approach his stay at the cabin as a kind of experiment in overcoming irrational fears. He viewed my warnings not as life-saving information, but as evidence of the psychological pressures that isolation and primitive living conditions could exert on even well-educated people. After ending the call, I considered driving back to the mountains to physically intercept Michael before he reached the cabin. But I knew that such an intervention would likely be dismissed as the behavior of someone who had suffered a psychological breakdown during his own mountain retreat. Without credible evidence of supernatural activity, evidence that the entity was specifically designed to avoid creating my warnings, would sound like the delusions of someone who had spent too much time alone in stressful conditions. Instead, I called Daniel Morrison and left a message on his voicemail describing Michael's personality profile and warning him that the next guest would likely require more direct intervention than usual. But Daniel's response when he called back the following day was grimly fatalistic. "I've been doing this job for 8 years, Mr. West, and I've learned that you can't save people who are determined to ignore good advice. All I can do is make sure the rules are available to them and hope they're smart enough to recognize the truth before it's too late." What about more explicit warnings? What about telling people directly about the entity and its capabilities? Then they dismiss me as a crazy mountain man and ignore everything I say, including the conventional safety advice that might keep them alive, even if they don't believe the supernatural elements. The system works because the rules seem like reasonable precautions until experience proves there's something more. Daniel was right, of course. The protective system that had evolved around the Hartwell cabin depended on maintaining plausible deniability about the supernatural threats it was designed to counter. Explicit warnings about entities and predation would undermine the credibility of the entire safety framework, leaving future guests with no protection at all. But knowing that the system was logically sound didn't make it easier to accept the moral implications of Michael Chen's upcoming stay at the cabin. I was condemning a young man to face supernatural predation with no understanding of what he was dealing with. and I was doing so in service of a greater good that required individual sacrifices to maintain collective protection. 2 weeks later, I received another email from the vacation rental agency. We regret to inform you that a guest at the Hartwell cabin has terminated his stay early due to personal reasons. Mr. Chen left the property after 5 days and has requested that we not contact him about his experience. We apologize for any inconvenience this may cause to our feedback collection process. I called Daniel immediately, but his phone went straight to voicemail. When he finally returned my call 3 days later, his voice carried the weary resignation of someone who had added another name to a list that was already too long. He lasted longer than most, Daniel said simply. 5 days is actually pretty good for someone who was actively testing the rules from his first night. But curiosity killed the cat, as they say. What happened to him? Same thing that happens to everyone who decides that the rules don't apply to them. The entity has a new voice to use against the next guest. And I have another family to contact with a story about their son disappearing during a solo hiking trip in dangerous winter conditions. Daniel, how many more people have to die before we find a better solution? A long pause, during which I could hear wind moving through pine trees in the background of the call. I don't know, Mr. West, I honestly don't know. But I do know that the alternative, letting the entity hunt without any restrictions or warnings, would result in many more deaths than the current system produces. That night, I began writing this account of my experience at the Hartwell cabin, documenting the rules and their necessity in a format that might help future guests understand what they were dealing with without requiring them to discover the truth through their own potentially fatal experimentation. But as I wrote, I realized that I was facing the same paradox that had trapped Daniel and all the previous caretakers. Explicit warnings about supernatural threats would be dismissed as fiction, while implicit warnings disguised as safety guidelines would be ignored by people who considered themselves too sophisticated to be bound by primitive superstitions. The entity beneath the Colorado mountains had created a perfect trap, one that used human psychology and rational skepticism as weapons against the very people those qualities were supposed to protect. It hunted by exploiting our best qualities: curiosity, compassion, logical analysis, and the desire to help others, turning them into vulnerabilities that could be manipulated to override survival instincts. Somewhere in the mountains, the Hartwell cabin sits empty again, waiting for the next guest who will arrive with confidence in their ability to distinguish between reasonable precautions and irrational fears. The rules are still taped to the refrigerator, still written in the careful handwriting of someone who understood their importance. The journals are still hidden beneath the floorboards, still available to anyone curious enough to search for them. And Daniel Morrison continues his lonely vigil as caretaker, watching for the signs that tell him when another guest has decided to test the boundaries that keep ancient predators contained within their traditional hunting grounds. The cycle continues because it has to continue, because the alternative is allowing something patient and intelligent and utterly inhuman to expand its territory beyond the mountain wilderness where indigenous peoples once knew to avoid certain areas during certain seasons. The rules exist because they work, and they work because they've been written in the blood of people who learned too late that some knowledge can only be acquired through fatal experience. I survived my stay at the Hartwell cabin, but I did not escape it unchanged. I carry the rules with me now, not just the specific protocols that protected me during those 2 weeks in the mountains, but the larger understanding they represent about the thin places in our world where civilization's assumptions about safety and rational behavior become not just inadequate but actively dangerous. And someday, when I encounter another person planning a winter retreat in an isolated mountain cabin, I'll face the same impossible choice that Daniel has been making for 8 years: how to share life-saving knowledge with someone who won't believe it until experience proves its necessity. The entity is patient. It has been hunting in those mountains for longer than human memory, and it will continue hunting long after current generations have forgotten that such places exist. But knowledge is also patient, passed down through informal networks of survivors who understand that some battles can't be won, only managed through careful adherence to rules that seem arbitrary, until the moment they save your life. The Hartwell cabin rules are waiting for the next guest who will need them. The question is whether that person will have the wisdom to follow them before curiosity demands a higher price than they're prepared to pay.